Patrick mentioned, we are starting a new series on the Gospel of John this morning. And maybe you were surprised that he read from the 20th chapter near the end of the book. I'll explain why we're starting in chapter 20 in a moment. The New Testament contains four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is often called the fourth Gospel, while the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the Synoptic Gospels. You can think of the four Gospels as biographies of Jesus. I want to say a couple of things about the Gospel of John as we begin. First of all, the Gospel of John is a unique gospel. Some of you might remember the classic Sesame Street segment, "One of these things is not like the other." Well, that's the Gospel of John. It's not like the other Gospels. It's different. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, include many of the same stories. They include or have the same sequence, many of the same words. If you do a harmony of the Gospels, you'll find they're very much alike. But the Gospel of John is very different from those three Gospels. You'll find many stories in John that aren't in the other three. Like Jesus changing the water into wine, Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, Jesus and the woman at the well, the resurrection of Lazarus, the washing of the disciples' feet, many other stories that are in John that are not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So it is a unique gospel, different from the others. Another thing is that the Gospel of John, I would say, is the favorite gospel. I'm not saying that it's your favorite, but I think if we were to do a survey today with the question, what is your favorite gospel? I think the top answer would be the Gospel of John. Often when we give a Bible to someone who's really never read the Bible before, we tell them, begin with the Gospel of John. And there's actually evidence that John has always been the favorite gospel. For example, we have more ancient copies of John than any other gospel, which I think speaks to its popularity. It was copied more because it was the favorite gospel. Maybe it's not your favorite, but I think in general, the Gospel of John is the favorite gospel. So why did we begin in chapter 20? Well, as we begin this journey through the Gospel of John, I want us to consider two questions. Why was the Gospel of John written? That's the first question. And the second is, does its purpose have any relevance for our lives today? So I want to consider those two questions. Why was it written, and does it have relevance for us today? And in chapter 20, there's actually a clear purpose statement for the Gospel of John. We find that purpose statement in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Notice the words, so that. This book was written so that people would believe in Jesus. Verse 30 says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Now, signs in the Gospel of John are miracles. The miracles of Jesus are signs because they show us that he is the Christ, the Son of God. People saw the miracles and they believed. They believed that he is the Christ, the Son of God. And so the miracles in John are sign. In the gospel, Jesus performs 7 signs. You could say 8 if you include Jesus' own resurrection. But really, the the first half of it is centered around these signs, these miracles. Of course, Jesus did many more miracles than just 7. Verse 30 says that he did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. We have some of those miracles or signs in the other gospels, but still, I believe that there are many, many miracles of Jesus that were not written about in any of the gospels. So have you ever wondered about the story of Jesus' miracles that haven't been told, at least to us? Were not written down and recorded for us today. It's an interesting thought. But John wrote these specific miracles for a certain reason, and we find that reason in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now, the first sign or miracle in the Gospel of John is Jesus turning the water into wine. And at the end of that story, it's in chapter 2, we read this, chapter 2, verse 11. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, was at a wedding, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. There's really, I believe, an obvious link between this verse and the purpose statement found in chapter 20. In chapter 2, we're told that the disciples were also there at the wedding. So they saw this miracle of Jesus turning the water into wine. They were there. It was done in the presence of the disciples, as John 20:30 states. The miracle, we're told, manifested the glory of Jesus. There's a connection there with chapter 1, verse 14. We have seen his glory. And so, again, the miracles are signs pointing to who Jesus truly is, the Christ, the Son of God. So the miracle manifested his glory, and then finally the disciples believed in him when they saw this miracle of Jesus turning the water into wine. So this is the first miracle written about in this book, and it was written, John says, so that we may believe. So there's a connection between this first sign and the purpose statement, really getting to what this book is all about, why it was written. So the proper response to the signs, the miracles of Jesus, is to believe in him. What exactly does that mean? Well, talk about that in a moment. But all of these signs were done, and John recorded them so that people would believe. The disciples believed, and John, we'll get to the author in a moment, kind of spoiled it, but you probably know, Gospel of John, but he wrote it so that people would believe in him. So the author, verse 31 says, begins with the words, but these are written. Speaking of the signs, these are written. So who is the author? Now you might be thinking it's obvious. It says right here, John, Gospel of John. But actually, the title wasn't a part of the original book. It was something that was added later. It was added for a reason, I believe. But it wasn't part of the original writing. So it's not so obvious that the Gospel of John would have been written by John. If you read the book from beginning to end and you look for the author never reveals himself, at least clearly. It's written as if it were anonymous. The author never mentions his name. But in the Gospel of John, there's an unnamed person described as the disciple whom Jesus loved. We find that 6 times throughout the Gospel, especially in the last half of the Gospel. The disciple whom Jesus loved. Some refer to him as the beloved disciple. The author of John claims to be the beloved disciple in chapter 21, verse 24. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things. So it's written as the beloved disciple being the author. And the traditional view regarding the authorship of the Gospel of John is that the beloved disciple is, in fact, the book's author, and that his identity is John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 disciples. That's the traditional view. There is a view now that the author is often referred to as the evangelist, that he's not actually the beloved disciple, but actually writing as if he were John. That's not my view. My view is the traditional view that this gospel was written by John, that he is the beloved disciple mentioned in the book. So John is the author. We can't be very precise when dating the Gospel of John. All we can say that it would have been written sometime between AD 70, after Peter's death, which happened around AD 66, because his death is mentioned in chapter 21. Would have had to have been written sometime before AD 100, because John would have to be alive for him to have written it, and he probably would be dead around AD 100. So 30-year window there, we can't be sure, but somewhere in that time. So it was written after the other three Gospels were written. They were written earlier. John wrote his Gospel later, and that might speak to why his Gospel is different from the others. So getting to verse 31, getting to the purpose of why this book was written. John goes on to say that the reason why he wrote this gospel included in it certain miracles so that people would believe. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So as we begin this series on John, this is an introduction to the Gospel of John, and I really want to focus on the purpose of John. Why was this gospel written? So we'll end with why it was written. I already gave a brief statement as to why it was written. It's fairly obvious why it was written when you look at those two verses. But let's go back to those two questions. The first question was, why was the Gospel of John written? Well, the Gospel of John, you see it here, it was written to convince people that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, which would result in them having eternal life. The purpose statement is connected to the previous verse, verse 29, where Jesus says to Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So John, in this book, he's writing to people like us. People who haven't seen, like the disciples did, the risen Jesus. He's writing so that we may believe. Even though we haven't seen Jesus with our eyes, we didn't witness those miracles like the disciples did, he's writing so that we might believe what the disciples believed. So that you might believe. So when he says those words, so that you may believe, he's thinking of his readers. Now, I don't know if John would have thought that 2,000 years later, people would be reading what he wrote. But when he says so that you may believe, he's addressing us. He's addressing those who are reading or hearing this gospel. So that's his purpose. He wants us to believe. Now, there's a disagreement among commentators about the correct tense of the word believe. And I'm not going to get into all of the technicalities of this disagreement. But it boils down to really, does John mean so that you may come to believe? Or does he mean so that you may continue to believe. And some think it's an evangelistic purpose that you may come to believe. Speaking of initial faith, believing in Jesus for the first time. And others would say, no, he's talking about continuing to believe, persevering in the faith. I'm not going to try and settle that debate here this morning. I think what we can agree on, if you know anything about the book of John, the Gospel of John, is that it really encourages both. Whether one was the correct exact tense of believe and one was not. But regardless of that, today we know that the Gospel of John encourages both initial faith and continuing faith. It encourages both. So if it just encouraged the one, initial faith, as many people do believe, if that's the only thing it did for us, then really there'd be no purpose for me, preaching on this book of the Bible for several weeks, because I know most people here profess to have already believed in Jesus, so there'd be no point in me continually saying this over and over again and maybe only addressing a few people, a couple people, I don't know, God knows, in this room. And so I believe the Gospel of John doesn't just encourage that initial faith, coming to believe. That's an important part, of course, and we urge each one here to believe if you haven't believed in Jesus for the first time. There is that type of faith that the Gospel of John encourages. But I believe it also, whether or not this was John's intended purpose or not, but it still encourages continuing in the faith as we read about Jesus, what he did, who he is. It encourages us to continue to believe. And that might be what we need. We might not need to come to believe for the first time. We might need the encouragement to continue to believe, or the encouragement in seeing how Jesus lived, how he talked, how he interacted with others, and all of that. Believe is a very important word in the Gospel of John. It's used by John around 100 times. It's been called the Gospel of Belief. He wants us to believe the truth about who Jesus is, the Christ, the Son of God. We don't have time to get into those titles. We'll see them in chapter 1. Speaking of Christ, Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah, the King who was promised. He's the Son in relation to the Father. He shows us who God is or what God is like. To know him, he said, is to know the Father. And so he is the Christ, the Son of God. He wants us, John does, to receive eternal life by believing in Jesus, which really is not just a future thing, but a present thing. In John chapter 17, Jesus defines eternal life, meaning to know him and to know the Father. And so it means to come into relationship with God, to know him forever, eternal life. But believing in Jesus, when we talk about believing in him, we're talking about more than just an intellectual kind of faith. Believing some facts about Jesus is not where John wants us to stop. Merely believing that, okay, he is the Christ, the Son of God. It's more than just believing in our minds these truths. It means having a faith that impacts our everyday lives. And so that leads to our second question. Does the Gospel of John have any relevance for our lives today? And obviously, my answer would be yes. Otherwise, why am I talking about the Gospel of John to you today? So I do believe it has great relevance. We talk about believing in Jesus, knowing God through Jesus, eternal life. There is nothing more important today than coming to believe in Jesus and continuing to believe in him. Edward Klink, a commentator on John, writes, this, referring to the Gospel of John, was never a story of something past. It has always been a story about the present and even the future. So it wasn't written just to tell us about things that happened in the past. That's a very important part of the Gospel of John. but it was given to us to impact the present, what we believe about Jesus, and to impact as well our future. Do we possess eternal life through faith in him? And so it's not just a biography of Jesus, it's also a message that can change our lives. So my prayer, my hope is, as we begin this journey through the Gospel of John, it is that we will all come to believe in Jesus. And that what John writes in this gospel will encourage us to continue to believe. And there will be, on top of that, of course, many challenges to us, things that we might need to correct in our lives. So there is that encouragement to believe, but there is so much more as well in the Gospel of John that we will see. And so that is an introduction to really the purpose of this book, why it was written. It was written so that we would believe. And nothing is more relevant for life today than believing in Jesus. Have you come to believe in him? Have you placed that initial faith in Jesus? Have you received the gift of eternal life? Are you struggling to continue to believe? Well, in a moment, we're going to be remembering what Jesus did for us. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. We need to, and John does this, reminds us of the love of God for us through Jesus Christ, his son, encouraging us to continue to believe, to continue to follow